I've been investigating classic religious stories in the Old Testament and the New, and I found an interesting parallel about a class of sin, you might say, in both of those sources, Old Testament, New Testament sources. So one of the 10 commandments is to not use God's name in vain. And you see, people think that means don't curse. That's the popularized idea, but that isn't what it means. It means don't claim to be motivated by divine purpose, so to use God's name, when you're actually pursuing your own selfish agenda. Right? So don't subvert the divine to your own ego, your own motivation, your own status, because status is very important to people, right? It's a fundamental psychological motivator. And status determines longevity, for example, and status determines mating attractiveness among men, socioeconomic status. Okay. So you can subvert that process by falsely claiming moral virtue. Now, the same thing happens in the New Testament, because the Pharisees, who are Christ's primary enemies, are the virtue signalers. I mean, Christ tells the Pharisees, who are the leaders of popular religious movement, tradition at that time, that the only reason they proclaim their allegiance to God and the prophets they purport to worship is so that they can have the best seats in the synagogues and accrue social status. And he compares them to tombs that are whitewashed on the outside and full of rot on the inside. And it's actually that accusation. That's one of the primary reasons that he ends up crucified. So the reason I'm telling you this, it might seem a bit obscure, but the reason that I'm bringing this up is because I don't think that we've come to grips with how powerful the temptation to accrue moral status falsely, so that's reputational status, how deeply seated and absolutely destructive that is. And like, absent a better explanation, and Rob Henderson, of course, who you pointed out, has touched on this with his idea of what's the name of his...
The luxury belief class.
The luxury belief class. Look how good I am. Right. And so first of all, I'm kind of curious about what you think of those ideas. Then I'm curious about whether you have any alternative explanation for this, because it's a systemic rot, right? We talked about the universities. We already decided, for what that's worth between us, that they don't look salvageable, but you really extended that argument to the political parties themselves, with the possible exception of reform, which we can talk about in a moment. So, like, where do you see? Two things. How would have you characterized your political orientation prior to your departure from the universities, let's say, and then what do you think of? What's your explanation for the pervasiveness of this rot?
Well, I think the answer to the first question is I would describe myself as, I mean, it sounds very vague, but as somebody who simply cares a great deal about his country, and somebody who is, in very broad terms, on the side of the forgotten majority of people who share small c conservative values, particularly on cultural and identity issues, who want to reform the economy so it works for ordinary people, but feel that they're no longer really in the conversation. And I don't feel as though my politics have changed over the last 20 years. What I think has happened is that we have been living through, over the last 10 years, the greatest radicalization of the elite class in Western societies since the 1960s. And I've seen this, not just in terms of the universities, but actually in Westminster. And I think the answer to your second question is to go back again to this idea of the luxury belief class. What we've been living through is an elite class imposing policies on everybody else, the consequences of which they are not going to have to endure. And I think you can see that in everything from mass migration, which across Europe, the evidence now is overwhelming. Serious academics, people like Professor Jan van der Beek, have shown this. The influx of low-skill, low-wage migration from the Middle East and Africa is a net fiscal cost to European economies, right? If you looked at it simply through the lens of a cost-benefit analysis, you would simply say this makes no sense. We've got to radically change the way we're dealing with migration. Yet still, the elite class won't change it. So obviously, this is about the accruing social status for themselves. But there's something else going on here too, which is the enforcement of these taboos within our conversation. around migration, around, what John McWhorter and others would call the new religion, the sacred values that we cannot question, pro-net zero, pro-migration, pro-diversity in all of its forms. And that's exactly why, for example, Jordan, we didn't get to the bottom of the rape gangs crisis, because it was people's fears within the elite institutions of being seen to be racist, being seen to be conservative, being seen to be Islamophobic, or whatever term you want to choose, which stop people from getting to the truth. So the imposition of these taboos, the imposition of these social norms of trying to tightly control the national conversation through hate laws, through these Orwellian things we have in the UK called non-crime hate incidents, which again are sort of police measures that are designed to stifle debate and discussion. All of this, I think, is about controlling the supply of information, stigmatizing alternative opposition to the elite project, and trying to use these taboos to basically impose this elite project from above. And the losers, of course, are ordinary people who are asking themselves questions like, well, why are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of young white working class girls being raped in Great Britain and nobody talked about it for 30 years? Like, that's a question a lot of people in this country are asking. Why didn't the legacy media do anything about this? And by the way, a legacy media in this country that is now complaining about Elon Musk talking about it, whereas the reality is, if legacy media had been doing its job by actually pursuing truth and taking the rumors seriously from the 1980s about girls being put on heroin and cocaine and alcohol and being gang raped in northern towns across this country and being trafficked from one town to the next. If journalists had taken that seriously, we wouldn't have had, according to one MP, she estimates perhaps up to 1 million children from the 1980s have been abused to some extent by these gangs. And the enforcement of these taboos is going on today, which is what makes it so remarkable. Even after the rape gang scandal, we've got a Labour Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who's now come out and said, well, if you want to discuss the rape gangs, if you want to ask questions about the rape gangs, I'm not going to give you a national inquiry into this issue, but also, and I quote directly, you are jumping on the far right bandwagon if you're talking about this issue. So again, it's an attempt to control the conversation, to suppress dissent, to suppress opposition. And ultimately, I think it's partly about individual social status, but it is also about maintaining and protecting this ideological project.